conceptual framework. Okay, it's actually a conceptual framework that standardizes the functions of a communication system into 7 distinct layers. So each layer kind of performs a specific task. Okay, and they work together. So so the physical layer works with data link layer works with network layer. In similar way, network layer works with transport layer. So they work together to transmit data over the network. Okay, and now I will kind of quickly explain um, all this layer in a break. I'll just break down and kind of say like what all this layers means. So let's start with the first layer, which is the physical layer, which is the layer 1, which we also call as L1 in our SOC team. As a cybersecurity guy, we normally refer to that L1. So what is L1? So L1 layer is something like which deals with the physical connection of devices, okay, and the transmission of raw bytes. So as you know, in computer, everything that we do is either a 0 or a 1. So the physical layer actually kind of the task of physical layer is to kind of transmit our communication, let's say from C1 to C2 in the form of binaries, in the form of 0 and 1s. Okay, so all the data that we speak, let's say it is voice, let's say it's image or text, so everything is kind of converted in 0 or 1, and the physical layer handles like all those information is encoded in 0 and 1, and then it is transmitted, let's say from C1 to C2. Okay, so now physical layer, as I told, like it deals with the physical connection of device. So physical connection of device, I mean like it is not just like wired connection. Normally in most of the cases it will be wired connection, but it can also be the wireless way by which, let's say, C1 is kind of connected to C2, and where the kind of the information is kind of going back and forth between them. Okay, so devices at this layer, normally like the devices that we refer to at L1 are normally like, let's say one is hub. Okay, and it also can be repeaters. Okay, and let's say one of the basic example to understand physical layer is that when you connect a computer to a router, okay, using an, let's say, an Ethernet cable, okay, the physical layer is actually responsible here for sending the data bits through the cable. So the data that is going back and forth in 0 and 1. So physical layer is the one which is responsible to send the data between C1 and router in the form of 0 and 1. And so that's all, like kind of, I think it's normal to kind of understand what physical layer means. Now, kind of let's go to the L2 layer, which is also called as data link layer. Okay, so what this data link layer does? So data link layer is a layer which actually establishes a reliable link between devices on network. Okay, so the data link layer actually helps in kind of setting up a reliable connection between, let's say, C1 and router, let's say between C1 router and C2. Okay, allowing them to kind of communicate effectively. Okay, it organizes the raw bits from physical layer into frames. Okay, which we can also tell as structured data units. And so what it does is, like, let's say I am sending out a text, sending out a big blob of text, let's say, and the big blob of text is actually, let's say, is converted to a big 0 and 1. Okay, 0 and 1, it is encoded as binary. And rather than just sending 0 and 1, which is happening at physical layer, there's a virtual concept that data link layer. What it does is, like, it makes it frames out of this binaries. Okay, let's say it divides the full chunk of the binary in 4 different chunks, 4 different smaller chunks, which we can kind of call as frames. Okay, and the data link layer helps in kind of ensuring that these frames are kind of transferred between, let's say, C1 and router, or let's say between C1 and C2 whenever it is required in a reliable fashion. Okay, so one of the good example to understand data link layer will be, let's imagine that there's a classroom over here, and with multiple computers connected. Okay, with multiple computers connected to a single switch. Okay, to a single switch over here. And the data link layer will actually help us ensure that the data that is transmitted between these computers happens without any kind of error. So it will also do some basic error checks and will ensure that the binary that is transferred between the computers over here is kind of happens in a reliable pattern. Okay, so that's kind of a basic introduction to data link layer. We will look more in depth, like what data link layer holds, but that's kind of, I think, a basic introduction to what data link layer means. Now let's go to the network layer, which is L3, okay, which we also call as L3. So what is L3 is all about? So L3 is actually responsible for kind of routing data packets um, between devices on different networks. Okay, so let's say this is one LAN over here, one local LAN. Okay, and there's another LAN over here. So this network is different than, let's say, this network. So let's say the IP address of the network address of this LAN is, let's say, 192.168.1.0. Okay, so we will kind of look at what this IP address means in much more detail. But for now, let's say the network address of this LAN, local LAN is 192.168.1.0, and let's say the local network address of this LAN is 196.2.2.0. Okay, so what will happen is that whenever we refer, let's say, this to LAN, we will say that, okay, the LAN address is 192.2.0 and the LAN address over here is 1.0. So if this LAN wants to communicate, kind of communicate with this network, okay, so let's say it does via router. Okay, so what will happen is that the layer 3 will kind of come in action. So what I said, that layer 2 was something which helps in which can kind of help you in kind of communicating between the devices in the local LAN itself. Okay, where the network is same, you can just use a data link layer to kind of establish a successful communication between all the devices in the local LAN. But as soon as you kind of want to communicate with different network, okay, let's say over here, different network, which the IP address of that network is 2.0, you can't just depend on data link layer in that moment. Okay, you need to use the layer 3, which is network layer, to kind of have a successful communication between back and forth between two different networks, for example, over here. So so one of the example can be, and this is not just like this is kind of a simplified diagram where we are kind of trying to establish a network connection between two different LAN networks, but it can kind of extend to a wider network. So even like, let's say this is the WAN, this is the India, this whole is kind of India, and this is kind of a US. So even a device over here, if it wants to communicate with this device, for an example, that is based out of US, we need to use layer 3. Okay, there is no other way by which we can kind of communicate with this device on a different geography, let's say US, and between this device which is kind of based out of India. Okay, so we need to kind of utilize, so here we're kind of utilizing that layer 3. So the layer 3 protocol, whatever protocol works in layer 3, that will be kind of responsible for routing our data packets from between this network, which is a different network, and this network, and it will establish successful communication between these two devices. Okay, so that's what kind of a layer 3 role is. So layer 3 role is basically to kind of establish communication between two or more different networks. Okay, so that's what network layer is all about in a kind of a layman terms. We'll be kind of looking more in more depth what IP address means and what not. Okay, what's the different component of IP addresses, like network address, host address, and all. Okay, now kind of let's go to the next layer, which is transport layer. Okay, which is L4, which we also call as L4. Okay, so what's L4 is? So L4 is something which actually ensures reliable transmission of data between devices. Okay, so it will ensure that, okay, there's a reliable data transfer between C1 and C2